For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I ask unanimous consent to speak to the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Later today, we will be dealing with the Veteran HUD bill. And I want to compliment the Appropriation Committee for deleting the $24.5 million for the Selective Service System. There will be an attempt to put that money back into the bill. I think that's a serious mistake. The military has not asked for the Selective Service to continue. We don't need it. It's a serious abuse of civil liberties of an 18, 19-year-old to continue this registration. The registration is totally unnecessary. This $24.5 million could be better spent on Veterans Affairs or some other worthy cause. But to put the money back in is a serious mistake. I'd like to remind my conservative colleagues that Ronald Reagan had a very strong position on the draft and selective service. He agreed that it was a totalitarian notion to conscript young people and strongly spoke out against the draft whenever he had the opportunity. I also would like to remind my conservative colleagues that if somebody came to the House floor and asked that we register all the guns of America, there would be a hue and outcry about why this would be unconstitutional and unfair, and yet they're quite willing to register their 18 and 19-year-olds. I do not understand why there's less respect given for 18 and 19-year-olds than they give for their own guns. I strongly urge that we not fund the Selective Service System today. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of the time.
The gentleman from New York.
At this time, Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, 1 minute.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remark.
Without objection, so ordered.
I would like to compliment the committee as well as the chairman of the subcommittee for deleting the $24.5 million for selective service system. That was a good move. To me, it was a heroic step in the direction of more liberty for the individual. There's no place in a free country to have a program of conscription and drafting of young people to fight unconstitutional wars. It saves $24 million, and I urge my colleagues not to support the reimposing, the putting back in the funding for the Selective Service. Ronald Reagan was a strong opponent of the draft. He spoke out against it. We do not need it. It's wasted money. It is absolutely unnecessary. The Department of Defense has spoken out clearly that it is not necessary for national security reasons to have a selective service system. And yet we continually spend $24.5 million annually for this program. So I urge people to, all my members, all my colleagues, to oppose putting this money back in.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I will yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Paul.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I appreciate very much this opportunity to address this amendment. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. I compliment the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Walsh, for deleting this fund or helping to delete this fund from this bill. This, to me, is a heroic step in the right direction. We have an agency of government spending more than $24 million a year, accomplishing nothing. We live in an age when we don't need a draft. We live in a modern age. Not only is it unnecessarily militarily to have a draft, it's budgetarily not wise to spend this type of money. But more importantly, I rise in strong objection on moral principles that the draft is wrong. In most of our history, we didn't have a draft. The gentleman from California early on pointed out that essentially since World War I, we've had a draft. And that is true since in this century, as we have seen a diminished interest in personal liberty and the growth of the state, we have seen a much more willingness to accept the idea that young men belong to the state. And that's what the registration is all about. I have a young grandson that had to register not too long ago. And he came to me, he said, you know, they sent me a notice that I better go register. Why do I have to register if they already know where I am and how old I am? That is the case. This purpose of registration is nothing more than put an emphasis on the fact that the state owns an 18-year-old. And the unfortunate part about a draft is that too often draftees are used in wars that aren't legitimate. This is so often the reason. If this country faced an attack, we should have volunteers. We should all volunteer. But unfortunately, the generation of politicians who declare the wars too often never serve. Some of them haven't even served in the past. But they're willing to start wars that are not legitimate, and yet they depend on the draft. They depend on the draft for the men to go out and fight. The one really strong reason why I reject the idea of the draft is it's so unfair. Let's say there's an argument made that it's necessary. I don't think it's ever necessary to violate somebody's liberty. But let's say there's a sincere belief it is necessary. There is no such thing as a fair draft. This is why the 60s were in such turmoil in this country, because the elite get off. If you're smart enough to get a deferment, you get off. Who suffers from the draft? The poor and the less educated, the inner city people. They end up getting the draft and getting involved, and they do not get around it. They cannot avoid it. So it is very important that we consider not only this vote on fiscal reasons and where we're taking the money. Quite frankly, I would much rather see this money stay in the programs where it is. As a fiscal conservative, I wouldn't vote for those funds necessarily, but any funding of that sort is so much better on principle than voting to perpetuate a system that has no purpose other than to conscript. Conscription is not part of the American dream. It is not part of the American philosophy. It is not part of liberty. It is a totalitarian notion. The Congress has the authority to raise an army, but it does not have the constitutional authority to enslave a certain group to bear the brunt of the fighting. A society that cherishes liberty will easily find its volunteer defenders if it is attacked. A free society that cannot find those willing to defend itself without coercion cannot survive, and probably doesn't deserve to. A free society that depends on the vicious totalitarian principle of conscription is by its very nature no longer free. As we gradually lost our love for individual liberty throughout the 20th century, so have the people and the Congresses capitulated to the notion of the military draft. The vote on selective service system funding will determine whether or not we are willing to take a very welcome, positive step in the direction of more liberty by rejecting the appropriations for the selective service system. There is no other vote that a member of Congress can cast that defines one's belief and understanding regarding the principle of personal liberty than a vote supporting or rejecting the draft. This vote gives us a rare opportunity to reverse the trend toward bigger and more oppressive government. Yes, preserving liberty is worth fighting and even dying for. But conscription is incompatible with that goal. You cannot make men free by first enslaving them and forcing them to sacrifice their lives and liberty for the policies conceived by misdirected politicians and international warmongers.
The gentleman from West Virginia's time has expired. The gentleman from California has 7 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I'd like to thank Chairman Walsh. I know what a difficult job he has had. We happen to disagree on this particular issue. But not only myself, take a look of the supporters that we have on this particular amendment. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff disagreed with the last speaker. The Secretary of Defense disagrees strongly with the last speaker. Floyd Spence, chairman of the Defense Authorization Committee. Jerry Lewis, chairman of the Appropriations Defense Committee. Mr. Murtha on the Defense Committee. Mr. Bill Young, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, opposes, which is very difficult, opposes his subcommittee chairman on this particular issue, not the bill, but on this particular issue. Steve Bouyer, Chairman of the Personnel Committee, Jim Moran, Solomon Ortiz, Kerry Meeks. I could go right on down the line with the bipartisan support. It's a controversial issue. This is the 5th time that this has been debated. My colleague, Mr. Paul, has got a full right to believe like he does. The independent view, however, is not the view, and the gentleman votes 99% against everything on the House floor. I expected no less. I'd almost let him speak more because I think he makes our case. This is a time-proven event. If we have a chemical or biological weapons attack on the United States, Selective Service, the President designates those health care workers, and then the Selective Service system would go in and select those people that are necessary to protect American citizens. Any delay in that would be foolhardy and would be very, very dangerous. GAO said that if we cut this program, it would take up to an entire year to establish a system. I would tell my friend Mr. Paul, I hope we never have to go to I will in just a minute, I'd be happy to. I would hope that we never have to go to a subscription program. I hope that that emergency and a conflict against the United States never happens to that point. I don't think it will. It could in the future. And if that is necessary, then we have to provide that backup. Think of the consequences if we don't. Millions of people, American citizens' lives would be lost. This is a better insurance policy than you can have in almost any bill that we vote on. It's very important. It is the 3rd tier to our active duty and our reservists. Peace and freedom is elusive. It's very fragile. In the history of the United States and the history of the world, there's been conflict. Is there any one of you here in this body that says that we will not be in another conflict in the next year? And with the threats out there that we have, we dare not support this particular amendment. And I would yield to my friend, Mr. Paul.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. You have called attention to my voting record. And I would say that if I could show you that I voted 100% for the Constitution, would you still complain about my voting record being 90%, 99% in opposition?
I said the gentleman
being for liberty is not a negative position.
I reserve the balance of my time. And I said the gentleman has got that right to do so very much, and I respect that. I just happen to disagree with this gentleman on this particular amendment. And to seek compliance in this, we're trying to let the potential registrars know that what their requirement is so that they don't break the law. President Carter in 1980 asked Congress if we would allow women to register. And the Supreme Court found that Congress could restrict that because at that time we didn't have women in combat. This issue has been debated 5 times, Mr. Chairman, and each time we have restored the Selective Service, and we'll restore it today, I'm sure. But I would also tell my colleagues that are opposed to this that in conference we'll be happy to work off the different dollars and funding out of the different areas. I am not hard fast on any of the offsets. The more important factor to us is the reselection and readministration of the Selective Service system. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time and ask for a yes vote on the amendment.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time has expired, and the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not
I ask for a
adopted.
recorded vote.
Pursuant to House Resolution 275, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed.